thanks for listening to the People Not Titles podcast. We are brought to you by our great sponsors, Land Trust Title Services, your partners for results.
Well, good morning, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you. I know we'll have some people coming in after the fact, but we're really excited to host this event on commercial real estate transactions. We want to thank you for your participation. I want to acknowledge our sales team that's on here. We have Carmen Carbonaro, we have Denise Hellstrom, we have Anya Poulet, and we have our senior marketing manager, Matt Lombardi, and then from our underwriting council, we have Bob Burns here in case we have any questions in that regard. And I want to welcome our commercial panel of experts. We have 3 commercial attorneys on the webinar today that we're really excited about. We have Harry Bartosiak from Lillig and Thorsness. We have attorney Jeff Horwitz from Horwitz Law, and then we have attorney Loukas Kozonis with Kozonis Law. So welcome everyone. If I had the virtual applause, they'd be really clapping right now. And then I want to also acknowledge and thank the president of Commercial Lending X, Brad Hettich. He's also joined us. So Brad, thank you. And he's going to be addressing some of the lending things that we come up with. And just to tell you the spirit and the heart behind this, we did a continuing legal education for attorneys in arming our residential attorneys and some commercial attorneys with some of the knowledge to equip them to really be effective in the commercial real estate space, because we see a lot of crossover, a lot of different opportunities that arise for a residential broker. And we just thought it would be really great to reach out to our broker constituency to really cover some of the cursory things. And then not just, you're not going to have all of your questions answered today from our experts. But what I hope is that, you will get to meet some of our great partners, our partner attorneys and our partner lenders, and get an affinity for them so that they could be a partner resource for you. If you have a transaction where you have a question or issue comes up or whatever, now you have a team of people. So let's get into it. Just really quick, what we're going to cover today is we're going to cover some of the basics. We're going to talk about kind of title issues as it relates to commercial real estate, and then we're going to talk about market conditions. We're going to talk about title matters that are unique to commercial real estate, as I mentioned before, and then we're going to talk about the major differences from an agent standpoint. What are the major differences between residential and commercial? And we're going to weave in our panel of experts as we go along. So let's kick it off. And again, we're glad to have her here. Also, if you have a question, we are monitoring the chat, so you can just get in there and hit the chat, and put in a question, and we will address those either right live as we go, or we'll address those right at the end. Okay, so let's talk about the different types of commercial properties. There are hotels and restaurants, shopping malls, strip shopping centers, factories, farmland, hospitals, nursing homes, apartment complexes, mom and pop shops. And something that's not unique to all of these owners of these properties or people that are buying and selling these properties and leasing them, what's not unique is they all have a home that they live in. They all have a residence. And so many times, if you're marketing your database and you're working that angle, which everyone is, they're farming, they're doing all those things, right? You know that those people are also the very same people that are involved in commercial transactions. So that's how close you are to every single commercial transaction. Let's take a look at some of the commercial stats in Chicagoland real quick, because they're very similar, and maybe some are even a little bit less exciting than the residential stats. For multifamily, in units and volume, we're seeing that being down year over year about 24%. Office is down, as most people know, about 60%. industrial about 40%, and retail about 37%. So overall, commercial real estate activity in the Chicagoland area is down 38%. And I thought I would have Brad Hettich, president of Commercial X, just speak to Brad. If you could just speak to whether it be a story, anecdote, whatever, what you're seeing in the Chicagoland market now as opposed to where we were maybe 18 months ago.
Yeah, certainly. I guess I would start off by saying, well, first, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you just fine.
Perfect. So I would start out by saying that I think there's two trends from my perspective really impacting commercial real estate. The first is interest rates. Interest rates have gone up quite substantially. It's making it very hard for people to afford and buy properties. And we're really seeing that impact. Well, let me go back in time a little bit. In 07 and 08, prior to the Great Recession, I'd have clients looking to buy apartment buildings or other commercial properties. They'd send me the listings. I tried to underwrite them, and I couldn't get underwriting to work unless they were going to put 35, 40% down on the purchase. I am now seeing that again over the last 6 to 12 months. I'm getting properties that clients are looking to buy, and I can't make the cash flow work at standard 75% financing. And I think the biggest issue is the sellers are kind of holding values up. They haven't identified the impact of interest rates, and it's making it very hard for people to execute and buy properties with 75% financing. And a lot of borrowers aren't willing to put more money down because they don't trust the value is going to be there long term. So I hope that helps to kind of clarify what I'm seeing in the market right now.
Yeah, that's the stagnation in the market right now, right? And you have a lot of leases that are active, but we know that those leases are going to be negotiated differently, right? Which is also going to impact value long range.
Yes, exactly. That is the other big fear, I think, if you've got a commercial lease that's got a maturity anytime in the near future, especially with office buildings, there's just a lot of nervousness that the value is not going to hold. I see a lot of people, every listing I see shows that the property, if it's multifamily, the rents are under market. And the question is, not every property in Chicago can be under market. Not everybody's going to be able to buy a multifamily building and increase the rental rates. So it is creating some stress for what the future cash flow is going to look like.
And Brad, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but that's when a person like you can come in and really be a great counsel, right, to someone, not necessarily you to tell them they're getting a good deal or a bad deal, but if we ask the right questions, you can provide the right expectations. And, if a bank is not willing to borrow you the money, generally speaking, it's not a good move for you to borrow that money from somewhere else. Is that kind of true?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes and no. I mean, banks are extremely conservative.
Yeah,
so it doesn't necessarily mean when they say no, it couldn't still be a good opportunity.
Yes.
But definitely today, if you're trying to buy a conforming property with existing leases and you can't make the cash flow work and get a normal bank deal done, then you either need to make the judgment call. Are you willing to put more equity into the deal to make it happen? Or is the deal possibly overpriced in today's market? And I don't want to predict what the future markets will hold, and I'm probably a little bit more bullish than some people are on investment real estate, but there's certainly going to be more havoc in the near term, I think, than benefit on the investment real estate side.
Okay, great, thank you. And we'll bring you back in to talk about what kind of loans are available out there and things like that. So thank you very much. Well, let's get into who are the parties involved in a commercial transaction. The seller really can be of any entity type, right? It can be an individual, can be an LLC, can be a corporation, whatever it is. The buyer can also be of any type. The lender, really the difference between, I think, the residential space is that lenders, there's a much wider availability of money and a bunch of different players. Would you say that that's true, Brad?
Yeah. There's two big differences. One, it's not uniform like it is with residential, right? I mean, you got Fannie and Freddie, and pretty much everybody who isn't even Fannie and Freddie conforms to their rules. You don't have that same set rules standards. Lenders can do what they want, and there are a substantial number of different types of lenders compared to residential.
Okay, great. Someone's saying, like, is my audio kind of choppy? Can everyone hear me okay?
It's a little choppy, Steve, but we can still hear you.
Okay,
You're
you're kind of choppy too,
microphone,
actually. Okay. All right. Okay, I apologize for that. So the different players, we have the seller, we have the buyer, we have the lender, we have the landlord, and we also have tenants. So that is, those are the two different, you have landlord, you have tenants, and then you have buyers, sellers, vendors. Let's talk about the benefits and detriments to a commercial transaction. The benefits are why people are excited about a commercial opportunity. There's higher prices, there's higher premiums, and from a title insurance standpoint, there's more expense in that way. And then there's more flexibility from a lender standpoint. There's no rent fund requirements. So that's what Brad was speaking to. The detriments from a title standpoint, there's a lot of additional work required for searching, examining, correspondence, those kind of things. From a brokerage standpoint, you as a real estate broker, how you can separate yourself from the rest is that it does require greater expertise. It does require navigating appraisal complications, value calculations, negotiations. Comps are completely different from residential, and as we mentioned, the lending is less traditional. So, from a title insurance matters, you need the commercial transaction. We also have Brandon Q, our commercial counsel here as well. So one thing is a difference is that commercial brokers have a statutory authority to file liens for their services against the property. So that's something to consider. You have property managers that have those same rights from a title insurance standpoint. And that in a lending standpoint, there's subordination, non-disturbance, and attornment agreements. These are used when tenants are involved. It protects the priority of the lender's mortgage. The lease is subordinated to the mortgage interest, and lender will not interfere with the tenant's lease rights. So if there is some scenario where there is a foreclosure, where the owner of the property is not able to pay the tenant, so long as the tenant is still paying their rent, is going to be okay in that instance. And Brandon, is there anything you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so if you're dealing with small properties like apartment buildings, you're not going to typically see the SNDAs or anything like that. Even smaller mixed use buildings, but more and more lenders, when you're getting to more retail and office buildings, even a lot of community banks that didn't used to require them are now requiring them. So it is an additional step as a broker you have to be aware of, that the seller is possibly going to have to go get some SNDAs signed, some tenant estoppel letters signed. So it is a little bit more hassle in the closing process.
Right. Okay. Fantastic. And then we have some easement and access issues. There's typically, this is not something that is relevant to a residential transaction where you will have multiple accesses to various properties that are platted separately. So they're often set forth in the plat of commercial subdivision, can be set out in separate documents, and allows neighboring property owners and their customers to use other parties' accesses. And I'm going to bring Harry in on this one, Harry. Have you seen this to be complicated when you're navigating through the plat of survey and just defining what the property situation is?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Sometimes it's complicated, but more often than not, it's just a matter of time-consuming review of historical title. I think more so than residential transactions, you tend to see lots of different easements, especially if it's for mixed use or retail locations, for example, a shopping center pad, things of that nature. You're going to tend to see historical references on title to the, sometimes dating back a long time to the development of the property. And over time, all kinds of different easements and other agreements get recorded for ingress and egress across different lands, for water rights, for maintenance of drainage purposes, all kinds of things. And most of the time, these references on these easement agreements is on title don't impair the intended use of the property. But you got to be super careful during, we usually have a due diligence period for a commercial transaction and the title review period to make sure they don't, and to explore them. And it could take several hours of work and back and forth with the title company and raising objections and clearing these questions up, if not flat out, removing old outdated easements. So that's where these transactions can get more time consuming, if not complex, sometimes complex too. And that's why it's a client education process. This is not handled in the same way as we would for a residential transaction where we, also do a detailed title review, but it tends to be a much quicker process to zero in and identify and remove necessary title issues on residential than commercial.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Harry. And so guys, I do get that my audio is choppy and I don't know what to do about it right now. So you're gonna have to forgive me. I'm gonna really meet in our panelists more ardently now. So let's talk about the survey. So we talked about the survey, and that's why really one of the other people that you need to have on your team is a great survey company that you have in your pocket so that you can work with them. And they'll be talking about the various encroachments and unique characteristics of every single file. The closing instructions, and Loukas, I'm going to bring you in. Loukas, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Let's talk a little bit about the closing instructions and how they are different from a residential transaction and what maybe someone might need to be prepared for.
Sure. The closing instructions that either a buyer or seller, oftentimes these closings are what's called, it's sort of what's referred to as a New York style closing, which is the seller or the buyer will send closing instructions to the title company, telling them exactly sort of what needs to get done, what needs to get recorded, what documents need to get exchanged. Oftentimes the parties, at least these days post-COVID, aren't showing up to the title company. So having really clear closing instructions to title is very important. And obviously being available to sort of answer any questions during the closing is also very, very important. And I just wanted to mention, because a lot of the other speakers have been talking about either the survey or SNDAs or estoppel certificates, there's oftentimes with commercial deals, timing is very important. You need to get in front of a lot of these items early, because the last thing you want is to be moving towards closing or have closing coming up and not having all your ducks in a row, be waiting for estoppel certificates, be waiting for an SNDA, and items like that.
Awesome. Thank you. Is that better? On my voice?
Yes, much better.
Okay, great. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. So we talked about the closing instructions. And joint escrows and title indemnities, we want to avoid if at all possible. And maybe I can have Brandon, let's talk just a little bit about joint escrows and title indemnities. Explain that a little bit more for us, if you might.
Sure. So as far as types of escrows go, there are a couple different types. So your earnest money is going to be a joint escrow account, usually in a commercial transaction. So both parties will have to execute escrow instructions directing the title company to hold the earnest money until such time as either the transaction closes or parties terminate the agreement, and then direct the title company to disperse to the party who's entitled to the funds. And then a title indemnity is basically an agreement where usually the seller will indemnify the title company in exchange for the title company's agreement to remove some matter from title. So a lot of times you'll see this in the context of mechanics liens or tax exceptions, like the second installment of Cook County isn't out yet, but buyers will want that off of title. And so you'll execute a title indemnity agreement saying that in exchange for the deposit of certain money with the title company will agree to remove that off of title, and then that agreement will be executed. So those are examples of those two documents.
Great, thank you, Brandon. Appreciate that. And then we're going to finally talk about these closing protection letters that the Illinois law provides that the CPLs are to be issued for all parties on all transactions under 2 million, but it does not provide that CPLs are to be issued for transactions of 2 million plus. So on commercial transactions over 2 million, the seller will not get a CPL. And does anyone want to talk about the impact of that? Does that really affect the buyers or the sellers at all? I guess it won't affect the buyers or the sellers at all, really. Harry, is it something that you would be concerned about?
Well, I was just thinking, I haven't really, that hasn't been an issue of big concern for the transactions I've been working on. I think that by the time we get done with the title review process and have a sufficient title commitment turned into sometimes what they call a pro forma, what the policy is going to look like before closing, and you've got your ALTA statements in place, that the comfort level develops over time, and by the time we get to the closing, if there's going to be a lack of a CPL, on behalf of my clients anyway, I think it's still, as long as we're dealing with a reputable title company, I've had that sufficient comfort to know that they're getting the benefit of their bargain title-wise.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you. And then the pro forma policies, a lot of times we talked about this kind of due diligence period where there is some, things that the title company is doing beforehand, and you can get that in the form of a quote by just working with your title rep. If you have a property that you're considering either listing or even purchasing, there's a lot of things that the title company can do to help you come up with the cost for that. And then finally, closing the transaction. The documents involved are kind of typical: deed, mortgage. What is not typical there is the assignment of leases and rents, UCC financing, various recapture agreements, and revenue declaration. And these are there's a few unique things here, like the UCC financing statement. Does anyone want to just talk a little bit about that? Loukas, do you have experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, these are sort of oftentimes, requirements of the lender. So while the mortgage might secure the real property, a UCC financing statement secures the personal property. And so again, these are items that are commonplace in commercial transactions that you don't often see in residential transactions. And so the mortgage just gets recorded with the county, and then the UCCs are also filed often with the Secretary of State. So,
Great. So let's talk just a little bit from an agent standpoint, what we'll be experiencing on the commercial versus residential transactions. You have tenant expenses. That's one big difference between a commercial and residential. Typically in a residential, you have rent, utilities. On a commercial, you'll have taxes, you'll have insurance, you'll have maintenance, And there's something called triple net, where basically the expenses would include all of those for a tenant. So that's just a little bit of a nuance there. A lot of people know about that, obviously. But from a management needs, there's residential repairs, maintenance, emergencies. But for a commercial standpoint, the maintenance could be codified by law. There could be on-site management requirements. There could be various things that are necessary. So that's another aspect, whether it be an expense or some kind of expectation. Typical lease characteristics with residential, the lease is extremely simple. You basically get you get your house, you pay your rent. It's maybe there might be utilities and those kind of things. But with commercial, the lease is much more complex. And so let's talk about drafting those leases. Jeff, what is your experience with the difference when you're drafting a residential lease versus a commercial lease?
Yeah, to your point, there is a lot more. There are a lot more nuances and things to consider. Going back to we talked about, for example, the additional rent, the taxes and insurance component of that. One thing that jumps to mind is you provide for a true up of what those actual expenses are at the end of the term, typically a year, right? So the landlord may anticipate or estimate what the taxes and insurance component of your lease is going to be or your rental payment is going to be. And you have to consider, hey, what if it is the actual expenses are significantly different than what the estimate is? So typically in your commercial lease, you're going to have a whole section talking about the recalculation and truing up or recontributions to make up for the difference in the actual versus estimated cost. You are going to have the much more some licensing requirements you may have in the lease agreement as well. If you're drafting a lease from the inception of the endeavor for your tenant, you may want to consider having in some sort of contingency built in originally, right? You may want to maybe your client needs to have a lease in place before they can even get the loan, but you're concerned about getting the proper licensing or city approvals. You may want to consider having some sort of contingency built in there for your client in the event those entitlements or contingencies don't come through. So there are quite a number of additional concerns you have to consider and take into account when drafting a commercial lease versus just a plain old residential lease, which a lot of times you can take off the shelf.
Yeah. And Brad, when it comes to financing, how important is the lease review in that aspect?
It's very important. Lenders do want to understand not only the term of the lease, but whether or not there's any renewal options, who controls those options, what expenses are getting paid, who's responsible for paying those expenses, is the tenant picking up real estate taxes, insurance, who's paying for daily maintenance, routine maintenance, major repairs on the property, and the length of the lease, if I didn't already say that. So yeah, it's the lease is looked at very seriously, a lot less so on just a residential lease. Residential leases tend to be more standard, but on the commercial leases, they're looked at very hard. And I don't mean to get in front of you, Steve, if you are going to touch on it, but were you going to talk about zoning at all?
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, were you going to mention zoning for commercial versus residential?
No, you can go ahead on that. You can go ahead on the zoning.
Okay, yeah. So I just didn't see it mentioned, and maybe some of the attorneys can chime in. But one thing, if you've got a client who's going to buy a property to operate a certain type of business in it, so it's going to be an owner-occupied property, or there's existing businesses in there, you just want to be sure that the zoning allows whatever business they're planning to put into the property, or sometimes what businesses are already operating there. Sometimes on a purchase, it may trigger an expense, some sort of visit from the city, an inspection of some sort that may now determine that a use isn't matching up with the zoning, or there may be requirements for improvements so that you can qualify. So again, the attorneys can probably address it better than I can, but last thing you want to do is buy a building that you expect to use a certain way and then get into the city for permits and find out you can't use it for what you think you wanted to use it for.
Absolutely. And Loukas, can you speak to maybe if someone's going to go purchase, let's say now there are investors out there that are hungry for purchasing property. that includes some type of commercial element. How early are you getting involved in the transaction, and what does that consultative process look like for you?
Yeah, well, it's I always suggest, getting your attorney that you trust involved early, because, it's better to sort of get them involved early, get questions answered, get the knowledge up front, rather than sort of going down a path and wasting too much time.
Yes.
And I just wanted to add quickly to what Jeff and Brad were saying on leases. There is a lot of nuance, and a lot of time a lease for one tenant in the same building will be different than a lease for a different tenant in that same building. And certain management expenses and costs to maintain the property are properly attributed to one tenant and charged to that tenant, but are capped or not charged to the other tenant. So it's really important to sort of review these leases thoroughly. And then sort of back to the zoning front, and I apologize for skipping around.
No, it's all right.
Getting a good attorney involved early is very important. And also, this is when sort of the title company and possibly getting some endorsements that you wouldn't normally get on a residential deal come into play.
Fantastic. That's great.
Steve,
Thank you.
can I chime in real quick? I just want to agree wholeheartedly with Loukas and add that for sellers of properties, having your attorney do a lease review beforehand can be a valuable exercise, in that sometimes the leases just need to be cleaned up. There might be some agreements between the parties as to the common area maintenance expense, additional rent, that aren't properly documented in the lease. And just like when you sell a business, the books and records of the company have to be clear and straightforward, or it devalues the property and you get a lower purchase price. So the lease is really, for investment property, so important that getting the lawyer involved to see if there's some non-controversial cleanup work that can be done, or maybe sometimes you have to negotiate a change or two with the tenant, but it'll be worthwhile to maximize the market value of the property. So I agree with Loukas that early involvement of a lawyer for that reason can make your client money, not cost them money. And it's
100%. You want to be certain that you know what you're buying.
Yeah.
People Not Titles podcast is proud to be sponsored by Land Trust Title Services, your partners for results.
Yeah, and is it, just thinking from an investment standpoint, is it a fair play for an investor to ask for the financial viability of the people that are engaged in these leases?
For sure. Matter of fact, I guess these leases can be very complex or less, or more straightforward for commercial properties. But one of the biggest things that we try to do is make sure that there is a clause when we're negotiating a new lease on behalf of a buyer, or sometimes an amendment to a lease, requiring the tenant to provide financials from time to time. Sometimes they push back on that. You don't want to go overboard. Sometimes it's just once a year. But that's all tied up into the value of the property, especially for real estate investors, is what's the cash flow and who is the tenant? And if it goes dark, even if they're obligated to pay rent, that's not good. So a good clause that obligates the tenant to provide meaningful financials from time to time is important.
Absolutely.
And Steve, if I could jump in here about the zoning issue as well, especially something for the real estate agents to consider. If they have a client coming to them saying, hey, can you help me find a commercial property for my business? I think it's imperative that the agents discuss with their clients and kind of get a basic understanding of what their client's intended use or business is. And so they can kind of have a general understanding or idea, and knowing that for the permitted uses of the area they're looking, meaning if they know that their client wants to operate, say, an auto repair shop, and they're trying to put it, looking at property right in the middle of a residential area, they may know that that's not going to be a generally accepted use in that area. And so I think it's very imperative that the agents have a basic understanding of what their clients' plans are to help them narrow down the areas they're looking for and properties they're looking at, and not wasting their clients' time searching and looking at properties that is clearly not going to be suitable for their intended use.
That's fantastic. And guys, Harry, Loukas, and Jeff, I know all of you also, do residential transactions. And, what is striking me now is that, your breadth of knowledge. I know on the residential transaction, there's complexities, but not to the degree even remotely as commercial transaction. And so for someone to choose you for a residential transaction, I think they're just getting super horsepower, but it also allows them for that element of being able to capitalize on commercial opportunities that arise out of those relationships. So just a plug for why people would use you, not just for commercial, but also on the residential side as well, because that we don't see that very often amongst our constituency. So, okay, so continuing, there's far less legislation. RESPA does not apply to commercial property. I know there are laws, obviously, but how does that impact? And I'll just go back to our panel again. It seems to me like that would mean there are less protections for potentially the buyers and the sellers in this regard. And so it is very much a buyer and seller beware, and you make sure you have your team of experts. Is that true, guys?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think to a certain extent it is, but there could be other, additional legislation regulations, like I mentioned, for the intended use of the property. So there are, there may be some less on the loan side, but in any event, to your point, yeah, I mean, with any transaction, whether it be residential or commercial, you should have your trusted team of advisors and partner, business partners and consultants to rely on to make sure you are, doing the right thing.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying, Jeff, is that there are less protections, but what that also means is that someone could have written in some even more onerous, whether it be on the lease or restrictions with zoning or whatever. And so, that doesn't mean there's no laws and it's the Wild West. It could mean that the law is even going above and beyond what you're actually used to, and you're even more restricted in some ways for usage or financing or whatever it is than you are on residential.
That very well could be correct. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. And the end user, the difference between the end user on residential, typically they want quiet enjoyment. On commercial, it is ability to operate and make a profit. And there's a lot of things that can happen on a commercial property that could render the tenant not being able to do those things. And all of a sudden you change the whole dynamic of a commercial property. So that's a little bit of the difference of the element there. There's pride of use. Residential frustrations could lead to destruction of property. People just, tenants just bust it and break it and whatever it is. And we've seen a lot of those stories where in commercial, the difference is that typically the management and owners are aligned because they have the same, one person needs to operate a business out of it, whether it be a retail business or whatever. And so they're not going to destroy their own property. Evictions, there are more legal protections and more difficult on the residential side, and commercial, there's less protections and easier to evict. Is that true in your experience? Let's go to Loukas on this. In terms of eviction on a commercial property, is it hard, easy, or about the same?
Sorry, you sort of cut out for me. Can you repeat the question real quick?
Yeah, on a commercial property, how do you see the process of evictions and the difference between residential and commercial?
Well, evictions are just high level kind of a pain, regardless of whether it's commercial or residential.
Yes.
It's taking a lot longer now than it was a year ago. It's an arduous process. I will say it is, technically a little bit easier with a commercial eviction than a residential eviction, but it's still a very sort of long and expensive process.
So you got to make sure that you have the right tenant in there and you're not going to have to evict them. That's for sure.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay. And are there any steps that, and let's go to Harry on this, steps that a buyer could take to make sure that tenant in there is not, they're not buying into a problem that's assigned kind of hidden into the weeds?
Well, on the buy end, in terms of avoiding potential, having a problem that might result in an eviction, I think the tenant estoppel is going to be your best protection. Sometimes it's hard to get tenant estoppels for example, with apartment buildings. It's hard to get meaningful estoppels from a lot of different residential tenants, but that's where you want to really hone in on getting a landlord's estoppel or the equivalent of it. in the purchase agreement, making the landlord represent that the leases are in good effect, that there's no past due rent, that there's no money owed from the landlord to the tenant, and also try to get the tenant to stop us, but do the best you can prior to closing, and make sure you get a comfort level that you don't have, you're not on the verge of having to evict somebody. Because as Loukas pointed out, it doesn't matter whether it's commercial or residential, who knows how long that's going to take. It depends on the person, depends on the court involved, depends on the judge and the time. And it's going to, even if you have attorney's fees provisions allowing for recovery of fees against the tenant, you might not be able to ever recover those. So I think on the front end, again, the due diligence is just so huge with a commercial deal, so much more than in residential, where we do an inspection and an attorney review letter. You really got the title company will give you a title commitment, but you've got to get under the hood of those leases and find as best you can and get the best protection you're going to get is tentative estoppels if you can get it, but for sure get landlord representations as well, or in place of if you can't get tentative estoppels.
Great, thank you. So getting into the difference of commercial and residential, the hours of operation, kind of obvious, personal, immediate, typically there's a monitoring service with commercial. Price valuations are very different with residential. It's a much easier to get comparables. With commercial, there's income statements and cap rates. And, so the value is very much dictated on the income of the property, as opposed to, this strip center sold 5 miles away for this, and this one's going to sell for this. And maybe Brad, let's just talk just a little bit about, price valuations and just some of the things that someone who's used to playing in the residential space should be aware of with commercial.
Yeah, so I just think, on the residential side, the majority of the valuation is always going to be comparables, as you indicated. On the commercial side, it gets a little bit more complex because certainly you do have comparable sales, but a lot of it is going to be driven based on the income approach and how much cash flow a property can generate. So you could, in theory, a mile apart, have two very similarly sized and built retail centers and have one retail center demand significantly more money than another because of the fact that they have much better tenants and much better leases, and the property generates more cash flow. Mm-hmm. So you do have to be careful when you're looking at properties and really hone in on the cash flow. Certainly from a lending standpoint, that's what most lenders are focused on, what type of cash flow a property can produce. So that's where we spend the majority of our time in analyzing properties.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Risks. Typical risk residential, natural disasters, income loss, damages from, income loss from the owners of the property, damages from tenants, commercial, all these, plus there's a bunch of other liabilities. So on a commercial property is a little bit riskier. And, we talked about that the formalities in purchase, fairly standardized. You all know that in the residential. In commercial, it's due diligence, closing process, more complicated, as we mentioned. Residential is a lower risk, and on the commercial side, typically the higher risk, more expensive, subject to economic downturns, potentially harder to finance, and vacancy rates could be higher. And so those are some of the things that you should be thinking about. And then let's talk a little bit about getting back to the loans. Brad, you don't just provide traditional financing. What are the other types of financing that you can provide for people that are maybe more creative or a little bit more outside of the box?
Yeah, so real quickly before I do that, go back to the risk profile for a second.
Sure.
What isn't included is, and if you're a residential realtor doing commercial for the first time, one other thing you need to be aware of that lenders almost always require on commercial properties is some sort of EPA search or report, an environmental search report. Verifying that there hasn't been environmental hazards on the property in the past, or there isn't a surrounding property that may have leaked and is causing an environmental problem on this property. For multifamily properties, that can just be a record search. But you often get into a phase 1 report if it's a more standard commercial property. And then if there is past leakage, you can get into a phase 2 report where they actually are looking at verifying what type of damage exists. And then you can get into required cleanups. So it's also something else that can quickly sideways a commercial deal if there is found to be an environmental hazard on the subject property or surrounding properties. So something to keep in mind.
And it could make the due diligence quite expensive as well, right?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, a phase 1 report is, $1,200 to $2,000. Phase 2 is typically going to be $5,000 plus. And if you start to get into cleanup, you can be within the millions depending on the damages. So, but definitely something to pay attention to. On the lending side, I always tell people if it's your first time doing commercial, again, the residential world really exists because you have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac offering long-term fixed rates. And the reason why people can get those long-term fixed rates is because they're government-backed bonds that get sold into the secondary market. The majority of commercial loans get done by commercial banks, which could be community banks, community regional banks, national banks. Those loans are being held on the bank's books. The banks are using their deposits to lend out. Because banks don't know what the cost of their deposits are tomorrow, not to mention a year or 3, 5, 10 years from now, banks tend to be conservative in the amount of time they're going to fix an interest rate. So the standard product in commercial lending is typically a 5-year balloon mortgage. So that is where you have a fixed rate for 5 years. At the end of 5 years, your loan actually comes due. You typically have a payment schedule based on 25 years. Most commercial properties get done based on a 25-year amortization, not a 30-year. Some residential properties will get done on a 30-year if it's apartments, but usually on a 25-year schedule. But what happens at the end of the 5 years, the remaining principal balloons out, and you either then need to renew that loan with your lender or refinance it elsewhere. And that's about 75-80% of the market. The other 20% of the market or so is what they call an ARM mortgage, very similar to a residential ARM mortgage. You actually have a 25-year loan term, but the rate is only fixed for that initial 5-year term, and then it'll adjust either every year or 3 years or 5 years after that initial term. So that throws off a lot of first-time commercial buyers. They're all going, I want that 30-year fixed rate. And it just doesn't really exist in the commercial world. There are some non-bank lenders that do package and sell loans in the secondary market as commercial mortgage-backed securities. They can do 30-year fixed rate loans, but you're going to see a substantially higher price for that because they're deemed higher risk than residential. So right now, a 30-year fixed on an apartment building with one of those products or another commercial property is going to be in the mid-8s to the 9% range, whereas a standard commercial rate, today is going to be, depending on credit and property and location, is going to be 6.5 to 7.5. So you're going to see a 1 to 3 point difference in pricing to get a 30-year fixed rate on a commercial property. Outside of your traditional bank lenders, there's a whole slew of different funding sources, from private lenders, different types of bridge lenders. You have those non-bank lenders I mentioned, via SBA loans if the building is going to be 51% or more owner occupied by a borrower's business. You can get up to 90% financing, and even in some cases up to 100% financing using an SBA program. So there's just a lot of different programs out there, and the criteria are a little bit different. And it's really about judging what a client is looking to get done, what risks they have, what is their credit profile, and then determine what will be the best option for them.
And Brad, if the people on this call have candidates that are interested in purchasing and would want to know what they qualify for, we'll give them your contact information. But basically, you just have some things that you need to get from them and then you can kind of give them an idea of which direction they need to go. Is that right?
Yeah, so we do pre-approvals for clients looking to buy properties, so
Sure.
they can go out and when they make offers, they got a general pre-approval letter. We will also do property-specific pre-approval letters. And what happens there is we get the listing, any financial information available from the broker, and we actually do a cash flow analysis. We come back to the customer, we share that analysis with them and their agent. We say, hey, this is how much debt we think we can secure on the property. Here's how the lenders are going to look at it. Why are we coming up with a value that's lower than what the listing agent has? And, you know, here's some things the agent left out. Maybe the agent didn't include maintenance and repair expenses, or they didn't include a vacancy factor. Lenders always underwrite assuming that there'll be some sort of vacancy over the term of the loan on a commercial property. Or maybe there's some other expenses that got missed, or the property's got real estate taxes today based on $1 million value, but it's listed for $3 million. So any lender's going to then make an adjustment to what they think future taxes are going to be when they underwrite the property. So there's stuff like that you got to be thinking about to be sure that the offer you're going to make is going to make sense and ultimately can get underwritten and approved by a lender.
Excellent, thank you.
I would just add that
Go ahead,
property
Lucas.
taxes and property taxes moving forward upon a sale are definitely a hot item now, and definitely something that buyers and sellers are spending a lot of time on, and that lenders are spending a lot of time on.
Great, and because that's going to be changing, right? I mean, it's
Yeah,
because-
just like Brad mentioned, just because a property is getting assessed at currently is getting assessed at $1 million, but you're looking at a $3 million price, that's going to have a big impact on property taxes moving forward. And as a buyer, you want to be pretty conservative and work in what you anticipate the taxes are going to be in the future into your pro forma, because it's going to have a big impact.
Yeah, and if there's, Brad, just listening to what you said, if there's a slew of properties out there that are on a 5-year balloon, does that mean that within 2 years or whatever from now, there's an or 3, and people either going to need to be refinancing or selling those properties because they're not going to be able to deal with the increased lending rate on that?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And that's what you're hearing in the media a lot right now. There's a lot of concern because there's a lot of commercial mortgage debt maturing in the next 3 years. And what's going to happen because interest rates have moved up so much. The good news here, and this is why I'm a little bit more bullish than some people are, is prior to the Great Recession, lenders were doing crazy stuff. They were lending 80, 85, 90% loan to value. They were doing massive cash out on investment properties, taking them back up to 75, 80% loan to value. None of that's been going on the last 12 years, 13 years.
Yeah.
So I don't believe as many properties are going to be as over levered as they were going into the Great Recession. But even with that said, if you have a property you bought 5 years ago, you probably amortized relatively little debt, and now interest rates have doubled. So we could be seeing some cash calls from some lenders. You could be seeing customers forced to sell properties, and we could be seeing properties getting sold at a discount again. And some lenders taking reduced payoffs in order to get some debt off their books. So it is going to be interesting. Hasn't materialized fully yet, but we're starting to see some glimmers of it with some banks starting to push some customers out.
Great, thank you. So I want to get to, we talked about the laws and the zoning. We got ahead of that a little bit. Building codes, fire codes, health codes, all these different things could impede use. We talked about just really quick building materials, but I want to get into contracts as we wrap up and just talk a little bit about it. Maybe we'll go to Jeff Horwitz. Jeff, what is the process? Someone wants to make an offer, talk just a little bit about what the process is, how it differs from making a residential offer to making a commercial offer.
Generally, with the commercial deals, from the attorney's standpoint, we'll see what will come to us usually is a letter of intent or offer letter executed or entered into between the buyer and the seller, kind of setting forth the general parameters or basic overview of the transaction, right? The cost, the timing, the period of due diligence, that type of stuff. And so that's usually negotiated or at least put together between the commercial realtors and their parties. And then that will come to us attorneys, and I kind of view that almost as the Bible, right? Or the governing document upon which then we will take that letter of intent, which is typically about a 2 to 3 page document. And then we will take that and transform that into the actual purchase agreement, which would be substantially more significant, a lot more details, a lot more legalese in it. And we will typically, that will be negotiated between the buyer's and seller's attorney, a couple of iterations back and forth. But again, holding true to the basic framework that is usually outlined in the letter of intent.
Okay, great. And Lucas, just bringing you in here, you can get kind of creative with this, with the purchase agreement for a commercial property, can't you?
Yeah, you could get very creative with the terms of a commercial transaction. But like Jeff mentioned, having a good LOI that's negotiated and at least all the material terms sort of flushed out at the beginning is invaluable when it comes to actually sort of drafting the contract and doing the deal, because oftentimes clients want to skip straight to a contract and move quickly. But if there's a lot of unanswered questions during the drafting of the contract, it sort of takes more time going back and forth and flushing out all the issues then, versus having a well sort of negotiated and all the terms in a well drafted LOI up front. But yeah, the terms can be wildly different. The amount of the due diligence period can be different. The amount of earnest money can be wildly different from one transaction to another. Just all sorts of different terms.
Great. Harry, anything to add to that?
No, I think Jeff and Lucas are right on. I think with the LOIs, when I see them in advance, sometimes it's usually the brokers usually know what should go in there, but sometimes the clients will present them for review. We just want to make sure there's non-binding language stating that the LOI is just an expression of intent, and usually the only thing that's binding is the obligation of the parties to negotiate in good faith towards a purchase contract. However, if you don't have those material terms in there, if you want to later add another contingency as a buyer, whether it's for a mortgage or for zoning or for whatever it is, it's kind of hard to go back to the other side and add a new large
a new wrinkle
material term. Yeah. So even if it says non-binding, you're kind of held. You're behind the 8 ball if you're trying to renegotiate substantive terms. So it might be a good idea to have the lawyer take a quick look at it. But in most cases, the brokers have sufficient upfront experience. But if not, that's no reason not to do a letter of intent. Get a lawyer involved to take a quick look first, put a term sheet out there, and make sure that you give yourself as much negotiating leverage as possible when everybody digs into the actual contract.
Great. And Brad, anything you want to add to the contract piece of it as it refers to lending?
Yeah, so certainly being sure that you have an appropriate period of time to get your financing contingency met is very big. I'll see a lot of clients that will enter into a 30-day contract or a 35-day contract on commercial, expecting that they can close at the same speed they can residential. That's just not the case. Your commercial appraisal alone is going to take between 2 and 4 weeks typically. And the approval process, like I said, isn't uniform. It can vary from lender to lender. So I usually tell people the optimum, usually for a closing on commercial, 60 days. And financing contingency probably in that 45-day range. Certainly you can have a full approval quite a bit sooner than that, usually into 2 to 4 week range. But just to give time for that appraisal to get done, environmental report if one's needed, just to kind of get all those I's and T's crossed, you're just going to need more time than you would on a residential transaction.
Great, so more time, and then God forbid there's EPA and things like that. That's a whole nother, that's part of the process too, but that could really stretch things out.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. I mean, if you have a transaction you really need to close quickly on, that's when you could look to use a bridge money or a private money lender. And then you may be able to get it done quicker, but you're going to pay a substantially higher rate for that. Anybody else that's going to use commercial debt, unless they have, they're leveraging other assets they have to buy something, and they've already got them leveraged, they're going to be in the same boat you are. It's going to be in that 45 to 60 day mark.
That's great. Okay, thank you. Well, and I just wanted to, this as we're wrapping up, if you're not really adept at the commercial transaction, the important thing is to build your team. We have the attorney, and we'll give you the contact information for Jeff and Loukas and Harry. Your lender, we'll give you Brad's contact information, but obviously you have other resources out there, and a great appraiser, an inspector. There's a lot of 1031 exchanges that are done in the commercial space. And so I think that that's a key, is to have a working knowledge of that and have a resource for that. CPA accountant that can crunch those numbers and make sense of there's more to the transaction than meets the eye in many cases because of tax implications. And I'll put a plug in for the title company as well, that yes, Carmen, we'll get you some recommendations. I see that for commercial insurance, mixed use. But the title company, we have a full, just putting a plug in for land trust, that we have a full suite of commercial experts, from examining to closing, and the entire range. And all of our sales reps are also adept at that and have contacts in the legal space that connect you up. So to just say that land trust is 100% on board and fully equipped to do all commercial transactions. Another aspect might be for you to connect with a commercial real estate agent and really partner with them and bring them in as a resource as well. You can become, of course, that commercial expert and that commercial agent expert, but it's also great to be able to partner with them for a referral situation. You can leverage your associations. I know they have a lot of training at the association level and a lot of certifications. I've attended those that are phenomenal and fantastic and powerful and really give you an edge and allow you to provide that expertise. So with all that being said, and then of course you have, the ability to get into CoStar and the various things so you can have access to the properties. I know a lot, that's a next step for a lot of people. Let me just check the chat here. Okay, so thank you, wonderful presentation. What does the inspection process look like? Harry, do you want to take that? What aside from EPA, how does the inspection process differ from maybe residential?
Well, conceptually, a lot of times it's kind of the same. We're talking about a physical inspection of the property. And so having a good seasoned inspector that knows commercial properties and has experience with that is important, and having a recurrent plat of survey to review at the same time is important if possible. But beyond that, the due diligence process takes, in addition to the inspection, it's all the other stuff we were talking about. Leases, if they exist, zoning status of the property. Environmental is different. That's a whole nother level of inspection. Sometimes we always usually start with the current records. But I think of the inspection process in the same way, but it's not, it's the same but different. I would say you have to have somebody that's experienced with commercial properties as opposed to a residential house. I don't think it's too much more complicated than that. Okay, great.
Let's just set the expectation and finally with attorney fees. Loukas, how does the attorney, I know that, on a residential transactions, attorneys typically get a compensation from the title insurance companies. Does that kind of vary on transaction to transaction for you from a commercial standpoint? What is the expectation for a buyer and a seller on the attorney fee aspect of it?
That's a difficult question, and oftentimes clients want to know up front what the fee will be. But because with commercial transactions, there's so much more back and forth, and you're not sure exactly what's going to be your
time going to be put in it, right?
Yeah, you don't know what title's going to look like until you actually sort of delve into it. You don't know what these leases are going to look like until you actually start looking at them. You don't know sort of how much back and forth it's going to take with the other side to actually get to a signed contract, or what issues will come up during due diligence, that it's often very difficult to to sort of give a, give a
Just a number.
price up front, just a number up front. There's a lot more work in a commercial transaction than in a residential transaction.
Yeah, and so, but just to be clear, it's not like, oh, $5.95 and I do all this, whatever it is. There is an hourly rate and for each transaction, and expect to pay for the professionals to be able to do their job right. Is that, basically?
It might be a little self-serving saying this, but if you find an attorney that's willing to quote you a really low price up front for a commercial transaction, I would be wary of that attorney.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, great. Yeah, so it's just a little bit different in that regard because of all the work. And by the way, all of the work, and even, a lot of times the best transaction made is the one that you don't do because of the due diligence. That investment winds up saving you a ton of money down the road.
Yeah, I mean, like Harry and Jeff have sort of hit this point. As a buyer, you're always going to sort of learn new things after closing when you actually own the property. But the job of your team and your attorney is to sort of minimize the impact of that new information and make sure that they're not material and definitely don't hit your pocketbook.
Amen. Well, that's great. Thank you. Well, from our entire land trust team, I want to say thanks. I want to just let you know that it's our goal to bring consistent, quality people in front of you. And so I want to thank Jeff and Loukas, Harry, and Brad, our partners. We appreciate the time that you are investing into our real estate agent community. And as I mentioned, we will send you the contact information for everyone there. And then I would just want to thank our land trust team for investing the time today. And agents, I want to thank you for your partnership with Land Trust, and want to thank you for participating today. So have a great rest of your week. Take care. Thanks, Loukas, Jeff, Harry, Brad. See you later.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks for listening to the People Not Titles podcast. We are proudly sponsored by Land Trust Title Services. If you enjoyed the podcast, please hit the like button, please subscribe, and we'd love it if you'd share our podcast with your friends. Thanks a lot.